Jolene Hastings and Diane Lockhart became the center of a nightmare the moment detectives uncovered the twisted betrayal that turned a quiet family home into the scene of a calculated, seven-day path of revenge that no one saw coming. Mark Hastings' death shocked the quiet neighborhood of West Briar, but the horror behind it ran far deeper than what the first officers on the scene could comprehend. It began with a neighbor complaining about a relentless, foul odor drifting from the guest house behind the Hastings main home. At first, she assumed it was an animal trapped beneath the building, but when the smell worsened overnight, she called the police. Officers forced the door open just after sunrise, stepping into a muggy, claustrophobic space heavy with chemical fumes and decay. Within minutes, they discovered Mark lying unnaturally across the floor. One arm bent beneath him as though he had collapsed mid-movement. His skin displayed dark, mottled patches, and the injuries across his head and torso made it immediately clear that he had not died peacefully. Nothing about the room suggested a break-in. Instead, it looked as though Mark had been lured there, maybe willingly, before things turned violent. Personal items were scattered across the floor. His watch, his phone charger, documents from his briefcase. Yet nothing valuable was missing. The scene felt staged, as if someone wanted investigators to see chaos but not confusion. The placement of objects, the smeared blood on the walls, even the broken lamp in the corner seemed purposely arranged rather than the result of a sudden struggle. The officers noted that the killer had taken their time. When investigators combed the area further, they uncovered a second phone hidden behind a vent, plugged in and still warm. It wasn't Mark's primary device, but a secret one that contained hundreds of messages, blurred photos, and short videos. The discovery changed everything. The content revealed an affair, one that instantly transformed the entire case from a suspicious death into something far more explosive. Mark had been involved with someone close, someone he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near, and as detectives scrolled through the pictures and messages, they realized the other person was not a coworker or neighbor. It was Diane Lockhart, his own mother-in-law. The affair timeline stretched back months. The messages grew more reckless as time went on. Plans to meet when Jolene, Mark's wife, traveled for work, hotel receipts in Diane's name, and private jokes about keeping secrets from Jolene. Investigators believed the affair wasn't only physical, it had emotional depth, the kind that left wounds deeper than betrayal. The final set of messages was the most disturbing. Mark had recorded a video in the very guest house where his body was found, suggesting that he planned to confess everything to Jolene soon. That recording timestamp placed him at the location less than 12 hours before his death. Detectives quickly turned their attention to Jolene Hastings, who had not been seen since the previous evening. When officers attempted to contact her, they discovered her phone powered off and her vehicle missing. Inside the main house, drawers were left open, clothes taken, and several personal documents missing from the office desk. Jolene had not simply stepped out, she had planned to leave. The timing of her disappearance aligned too closely with Mark's murder for investigators to consider it a coincidence. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the house earlier that week, though no one could identify who was speaking or what the argument was about. What they did recall, however, was the sight of Jolene standing alone in her driveway 2 nights before the murder, staring at the guest house as if studying it carefully. Her face looked drained, hollow, almost expressionless. At the time, they assumed she was simply tired or stressed. Now, that moment took on a chilling new meaning. Within hours, detectives concluded that Mark's death was not a random act. It was personal, calculated, and driven by a level of betrayal few could imagine. And the one person with the strongest motive had vanished, leaving behind only the horrifying remains of a marriage built on secrets that finally erupted into violence. Detectives launched a full-scale search for Jolene Hastings the moment her disappearance became clear, but what they uncovered during those first 48 hours suggested she had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone suspected. Surveillance footage from hardware stores, gas stations, and discount markets showed her moving through aisles calmly, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and keeping her face angled away from cameras. She bought duct tape, gloves, bleach, large plastic tarps, gas canisters, and even a disposable burner phone. Separately, none of these purchases meant much. Together, they created a picture of someone who had anticipated the need to cover tracks, erase evidence, and stay unreachable. Investigators mapped her movements, tracing each purchase to a different location miles apart, as though she intentionally avoided forming a recognizable pattern. Yet the timestamps on the receipts revealed something else. These items were not bought in the heat of the moment. They were accumulated slowly across several days leading up to Mark's death. This detail suggested premeditation far beyond a spontaneous act of violence. To detectives, it looked like she had reached a breaking point long before the final confrontation. Inside the Hastings home, officers found more signs of preparation. A suitcase was missing, but random clothing drawers had been left open, creating the appearance of a rushed escape. Investigators quickly determined this was staged. Only specific items were gone: documents, medication, cash, and clothing suitable for travel. Everything else appeared untouched. The house itself felt frozen in time, as if Jolene had walked through each room and deliberately chosen what to carry forward and what to abandon forever. Forensic teams performed luminol testing in several rooms and found faint traces indicating something had been smashed and cleaned up. Behind one of the patched sections in the hallway, they uncovered fragments of broken drywall with embedded glass, suggesting Jolene had destroyed something with significant force, the kind of act fueled by emotional collapse. That damage occurred days before the murder, confirming she was unraveling long before Mark's body was discovered. Investigators expanded their search to her abandoned storage locker, which held another set of grim clues. Dozens of printed messages between Mark and Diane were stacked neatly in labeled boxes, indicating she had been collecting evidence of the affair for some time. The more they read, the more they realized how deep the betrayal cut. Some messages hinted at future plans between Mark and Diane, plans that would have eventually forced Jolene out of her own marriage. Detectives believed this discovery might have pushed her from heartbreak into vengeance. As they continued piecing together the timeline, highway cameras became their strongest lead. Jolene's SUV was seen traveling out of West Briar early the morning after Mark's death. She drove north, then west, then back east, looping through rural areas with no clear destination. She avoided toll roads and major intersections, sticking to small highways and wooded back roads. At a gas station 2 towns over, she filled the tank using cash while keeping her face hidden behind a scarf. Witnesses recalled the vehicle but not the driver. She moved with an eerie calmness, never revealing distress or panic. As investigators closed in on the timeline, they realized Jolene's silence was intentional. She hadn't fled in fear. She had vanished in a way that made her almost impossible to track. Each move appeared deliberately spaced apart, as though she was following a plan only she understood, one that stretched far beyond the night Mark died. Her disappearance was not an escape. It was the beginning of something larger, something she had prepared for meticulously. Detectives now believed Jolene wasn't simply running from what she had done. She was moving toward something else, and the items she left behind hinted that her path was not yet complete. The search for Jolene shifted from locating a fleeing suspect to trying to understand the mind of someone who felt betrayed on every level and responded with a chilling, calculated precision. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized she was not improvising. She was following her own blueprint, one step at a time, one day at a time, leaving a trail too deliberate to be accidental. Diane Lockhart became the central focus of the investigation the moment detectives confirmed her secret connection to Mark. She arrived at the police station wrapped in a long coat, her hair hastily tied back, eyes red as though she had been crying for hours. At first she appeared concerned and cooperative, answering questions softly and insisting she had no idea where Jolene could have gone. But the more investigators pressed, the more cracks appeared beneath her carefully composed exterior. Her hands trembled when Mark's name was mentioned, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. What troubled detectives most was her inconsistent storytelling. She claimed she had not spoken to Mark for several days before his death, but a forensic sweep of her phone revealed a different truth. Thousands of deleted messages were recovered, many of them from the days leading up to the murder. Some were desperate, pleading with Mark not to reveal their relationship. Others were heated, warning him that Jolene was behaving strangely and might have discovered everything. One message stood out above the rest, a final communication from Jolene herself, sent late the night before Mark's body was found. It contained nothing more than a set of GPS coordinates. These coordinates led investigators to an isolated cabin nestled deep within a wooded area outside town. The structure was small, dark, and cold, its single window covered with thick curtains. From the moment detectives forced the door open, they sensed something disturbing. The walls were plastered with printed photos. Mark, Diane, and Jolene in happier years, cut and rearranged into fractured collages. Some photos were burned at the edges, while others had been scribbled over with red ink. Several captions in Jolene's handwriting repeated the same sentence. "They thought I wouldn't find out." The cabin showed evidence of recent occupancy. Footprints tracked dirt across the floor, and a still, warm mug of coffee sat on the small kitchen counter. Detectives found torn pieces of fabric near the fireplace and charred scraps of paper in the ash pan, suggesting someone had attempted to destroy documents in a hurry. Yet nothing indicated who had been there last or where they had gone afterward. Diane was brought to the scene in hopes that her reaction might provide clues. When she saw the photos covering the walls, her legs nearly buckled, and detectives had to catch her before she fell. Her shock was genuine, but investigators could not determine whether it came from guilt, fear of Jolene, or the sudden realization of how deeply their betrayal had cut. She stared at every image as though seeing herself for the first time, not as a mother or partner, but as the focus of someone's unraveling grief. As detectives searched deeper into the cabin, they uncovered more hints of Jolene's emotional spiral. A drawer contained a stack of handwritten notes, some written weeks earlier, detailing suspicions, observations, and cryptic clues about the affair. She had recorded details of Diane's visits, Mark's odd behavior, and times when they had claimed to be elsewhere. It was clear Jolene had pieced everything together long before confronting either of them, quietly gathering evidence while constructing a timeline of their deception. There were also signs of a more recent confrontation. A vase lay shattered across the back wall, and a half-open suitcase sat on the bed, filled with clothing Diane later identified as her own. She was adamant that she had not been at the cabin recently, but investigators doubted her certainty. Either she had been brought there without memory, or Jolene had stolen her belongings intentionally, building psychological pressure piece by piece. The chilling truth became harder to ignore. Jolene had not simply reacted impulsively to betrayal. She had prepared for confrontation, possibly even punishment, targeting both the husband who deceived her and the mother who shattered the last place she expected betrayal to come from. As detectives left the cabin, one detail haunted them. In the dust near the back exit, a clear set of footprints led into the surrounding woods. Only one set, belonging to someone wearing boots Jolene was known to own. The prints went deeper into the trees before fading into dense foliage. Jolene had been there. Diane had been a target, and the investigation had only uncovered the beginning of her plan. Investigators realized they were no longer following a missing woman, but tracing the deliberate path of someone leaving behind a sequence of messages only she understood. When they laid out all the locations linked to Jolene, stores, abandoned properties, remote cabins, motels, they noticed an eerie structure forming. Each place was spaced almost exactly 24 hours apart, as if Jolene had marked each stop with the precision of a countdown. What seemed at first like chaotic fleeing now appeared methodical, calculated, and symbolic. She wasn't running from her crime, she was traveling through the aftermath of her heartbreak, marking every point along the way with pieces of her rage. The first marker came from a small motel room where the housekeeper found torn shirts stuffed into a drawer. It belonged to Mark, with his initials stitched into the collar. The shirt was ripped at the sleeves, and bleach stains spread across the fabric like pale scars. Detectives interpreted this as Jolene's way of destroying the last fragments of her marriage. The motel room itself was left spotless except for that single item, positioned in a way that made it impossible to overlook. The next stop was a rest area where a burned wedding invitation lay inside a trash bin, its edges curled inward as if the fire was extinguished prematurely. Surveillance cameras showed Jolene's SUV pulling in just before midnight, staying for no more than 5 minutes. This second marker painted the picture of a woman stripping away the symbols of commitment, burning the promises she once believed would last. At an empty parking lot miles away, investigators discovered the shattered remains of a picture frame. A photograph inside, a family portrait taken during a holiday gathering, had been slashed multiple times. Tiny shards of glass glittered across the asphalt, undisturbed by wind or wildlife, which meant it had been placed late at night, carefully, intentionally. The message felt personal. The family she trusted had broken her long before she broke the glass. By the fourth location, the isolated cabin already inspected earlier, the pattern deepened. Jolene had not randomly chosen it. She had deliberately left behind a distorted gallery of the affair, using the space to expose what had been hidden from her for so long. Detectives now saw it as the midpoint of her 7-day spiral, a place where anger transformed into action, where she confronted the reality she had dreaded but prepared for. The fifth location, a quiet campground surrounded by dense trees, revealed more signs of her symbolic journey. The soil near a ring of stones was soaked with gasoline, though no fire had been set. In the center of the ring, a melted candle sat atop a single photograph of Diane, its wax fused to the image like a scar. Investigators believed Jolene had planned a fire but changed her mind at the last second. This hesitation puzzled them. It was the first sign that her actions were not entirely predictable. At a lake several miles away, the sixth marker told another part of the story. A plastic bag containing Diane's jewelry lay half buried near the shoreline. Each piece had sentimental value. A necklace Diane wore often, earrings Jolene had given her years before, and a small bracelet that once belonged to Diane's own mother. Leaving them behind in a place associated with peace and reflection felt deliberate, as if Jolene wanted Diane to lose pieces of herself, just as Jolene had lost parts of her own life. The seventh and final marker proved the most chilling. At an abandoned factory on the outskirts of a nearly deserted town, investigators found a handwritten note taped to a rusted beam. The message read, "The last day is mine." Fresh footprints circled the structure, and tire tracks led to a drainage ditch behind the building. Nearby, ashes mixed with fabric fibers suggested something had been burned, something investigators could not fully identify. This last message forced detectives to confront an unsettling possibility. Jolene's journey had not been a panicked escape but a ritual of closure, rage, and finality. Each stop symbolized another layer of her betrayal, and each object she left behind carried a piece of the story she refused to speak out loud. The seventh message made one thing clear: she believed her revenge was not finished. The pattern was no longer random, and the investigation took on a new urgency. Jolene had marked 7 days, 7 places, and 7 reminders of what had been taken from her. Now, detectives understood they were racing toward an ending she had crafted long before they even knew a crime had occurred. On the 7th morning of the investigation, just as detectives believed they were finally catching up with the trail Jolene had carved across the region, a call came from a farmer on the outskirts of a rural town 2 hours away. He had noticed smoke drifting above the tall grass behind his field at dawn and assumed it was an illegal trash burn. But something about the smell, sharp, chemical, and metallic, made him uneasy enough to call authorities. When investigators arrived and stepped through the overgrown grass, they found a burnt-out vehicle hidden in a shallow dip in the terrain, as if someone had intentionally chosen the most concealed spot on the property. The flames had died down, leaving behind twisted metal, shattered glass, and scorched earth that still radiated faint heat. Forensic teams approached carefully. Within minutes, they found human remains in the driver's seat, so severely damaged that gender and features were unrecognizable. The only intact identifiers were fragments of dental structure. It took several hours to compare the remains to dental records, but the conclusion was undeniable: the body was not Jolene's. It belonged to Diane Lockhart. The mother who had betrayed her daughter had met a brutal end that mirrored the violence inflicted on Mark. The pattern was unmistakable. Both victims had suffered blunt force trauma, and both scenes showed deliberate attempts to destroy evidence. This was not panic or clumsiness. It was consistent, controlled, and fueled by the same rage that had begun in the guest house. Near the charred vehicle, detectives found a small travel bag hidden beneath a patch of dirt that looked recently disturbed. Inside were Jolene's identification documents, a partially burned passport, a nearly empty bottle of painkillers, and a weathered journal filled with handwritten pages. The journal became the most critical piece of evidence, offering investigators the closest thing to Jolene's voice since she vanished. Her entries traced the emotional decay she suffered after discovering the affair. Observations of suspicious behavior, moments when conversations felt rehearsed, nights when Mark came home smelling of a perfume he insisted belonged to a coworker. The betrayal did not hit all at once. It slowly dissolved every part of her trust until she felt she was living among enemies rather than family. The entries around the final week grew darker, fragmented, and haunting. She wrote about sleepless nights, intrusive thoughts, and a growing certainty that her life had been built on lies. She mentioned feeling watched, manipulated, and discarded. The last entry, scribbled with shaky handwriting, lacked any details explaining her plans or her immediate intentions. It contained only a single sentence: "I did what they never expected." To investigators, the journal provided something they had not yet found: a window into the emotional storm that shaped Jolene's final actions. But it offered no clues to her current whereabouts. Tire impressions near the burned vehicle revealed that another car had been parked beside it, one that did not match Jolene's SUV. This indicated she had switched vehicles, possibly hours before the fire. Highway cameras revealed nothing. There were no sightings, no transactions, no digital traces. It was as though she had stepped out of her life and dissolved into the landscape. Authorities issued a nationwide alert, but weeks passed with no confirmed sightings. Some locals claimed to have seen a woman resembling her hitchhiking near a border checkpoint. Others insisted she rented a cabin further north using a false name. None of these leads could be verified. The trail grew colder by the day, and eventually, the investigation reached a standstill. Detectives considered two possibilities. Either Jolene had successfully created a new identity and slipped into a life where no one would think to look for her, or she had met her own end somewhere in the wilderness after completing what she believed was justice. The absence of her SUV, later found abandoned in another state, and the meticulous planning evident in her trail suggested survival was more likely. She had demonstrated patience, intelligence, and a chilling capacity for planning. If she wanted to disappear, she had the skill to make it permanent. Years later, the case remains open, with Jolene Hastings listed on multiple fugitive registries. The town of West Briar still speaks of her story with a mix of horror and disbelief. What began as a hidden affair spiraled into a calculated, symbolic journey of vengeance that claimed 2 lives and left one woman vanished into uncertainty. The final truth of where Jolene went, or whether she still carries the weight of her vengeance, remains a mystery that no investigation has been able to solve.